Hi, I'm Noelle Hyman with paperclipping.com, and we're at the booth of Wow Embossing Powders, and I'm here with Jennifer and Tanya. Hello, ladies.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks for demonstrating for us today. We're going to do a demo because we want to see your melted powders along with some of the other powders and some of the things we can do, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So this is Wow Embossing Powders, but what we're going to show you is something a little different from the traditional use of embossing powders. Mostly the industry has known embossing as a two-dimensional element or way of embellishing, where you're stamping an image onto cardstock for a card or maybe scrapbooking paper for a layout, and then you heat emboss to give texture or a raised look to your images or words. And what we're showing is that you can use embossing powders beyond that and reach multiple kinds of crafters, because you can melt it down and create your own embellishments, or you can use embossing powders on other things and recolor them or repurpose them to look different and create your own custom embellishments and pieces. So what we have here are some different items. We've made flowers where we've melted our embossing powder and created our own embellishments, and using different silicone molds. We also have some techniques where we've used our ultra high product and we've actually impressed stamping images into that to create texture. And then what Tanya will show you while I'm showing you some of the melting is actually taking just flowers and making them beautiful with some of the embossing powders and using stamps and different powders to create designs on there. So between the two of us, I think we can put together a pretty neat little embellishment for you this morning.
Let's do it.
Great. So I'm going to start and I'm going to explain the melting process of embossing powders, and then while I'm actually melting, because that'll take maybe a minute or two, Tanya will go into the backdrop of what we're going to create here, and she'll explain just how to embellish a flower. But one of the new products we introduced at this show is called Melt It, and this is an extender to embossing powders. Most of the colors that your buyers will purchase are going to come in smaller jars. If you can actually hand me one right there in your hand, the jar. The small one, that'd be great. So something like this, and if you were to melt it, you might end up using all of it to actually create a mold. And this mold is pretty big, so you would use a lot of it to create that, which you could do, but why when you have so many things to do with embossing powders? So what we have is Melt It, which is actually a powder that is almost dust. It's so fine, and what it does, it gives more bulk to the powder here, so that it extends it and you have more to work with, but you use very little pigment itself. So I'll just show you how I'll mix that together. What I'm going to do is put a teaspoon, actually let's do a couple teaspoons because I'll do a few flowers, a couple teaspoons of the Melt It into a little pie tin. This is our little secret. You can find crafting supplies anywhere, even at the grocery store or market. We use pie tins from the baking section because I don't have a Melt It pot, but you can certainly use your Melt It. I'm going to use just a little bit. You see how just about a half teaspoon, quarter teaspoon of our Pantry Collection blueberry. So you see I only used a little bit. That was a little bit of the jar. It would be just a fraction of that jar. And then I'm actually going to add a touch of silver to this to give it a little shine.
Is that a glittered one?
This is just a metallic, actually. We do have some amazing glittered embossing powders, but this is a metallic.
Okay.
So then I'm just going to stir that together. Now the little tip here is that I put blueberry in here, but it's actually going to come out with a creamy color and more of an antique vintage look, similar to this item, which used paprika from the Pantry Collection. The reason why is that this collection is made or has our earth tone colors, and they're made with an opaque polymer, which means the plastic used for the embossing powder is actually opaque white in the core of it. And so when it melts, it's the white that comes through instead of melting translucent like some of our other colors. So with the range of products that we have, it's really going to be interesting to see how you can come up with the different looks based on the colors that you use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my heat gun, I'm going to hold it underneath this tin, and I'm going to start to melt it. But while I do that, I'll step back just a little bit, and then Tanya will start to show you how to embellish a flower. And I'll see if I'm coordinated enough to talk you through that and do this at the same time. So let me just turn this on, and I'm going to turn it away because it'll be a little bit loud.
Okay.
Okay? And then I'll have Tanya go.
Nice.
So, oh, you can talk too. But
Okay.
So we're going to start making this little flower here. And first of all, I'm taking my ink pad directly to my flower and making sure that it's covered properly to get good surface. And I'm just going to use a piece of paper underneath. It's important that you use just a scrap piece of paper. You shouldn't use anything plastic when you're putting away your embossing powder, because our powders are especially treated to be static free. It's a process that is repeated twice, and our jars are also especially formulated to be static free. So as long as you store the embossing powders in the jar, you are not going to be introducing static into your embossing powder. So we're trying to explain to our customers is that they can use an anti-static bag if they want, but what you're doing with anti-static is you're only removing moisture, which you're transferring from your fingers onto the paper, and that's where the little bits will stick. The flower is a bit porous, so it is absorbing the embossing powder, but that's all right. This is only my first layer. I've got quite a few layers to go, and we're gonna get this lovely glossy effect. I've embossed that first with apple white, and now I'm gonna stamp over it with our flowers background stamp. So just making sure that I'm inking that up. And I'm going to emboss that, making sure.
So our stamps are all very intricate in design, and what's fabulous about that is that it complements the powders well, because you can see how just our regular powders easily pick up the designs of any of our stamps. Sometimes, and I think this is from the folks that used embossing powder way back when, there's a misconception that you'll lose your image if you stamp it and then emboss it. But you can see it's pretty intricate even on a fabric flower.
Yeah, I can see it.
So I'm just going to go ahead and emboss that. And as you can see, our embossing powders, they start to melt pretty quickly. So I've just embossed over that with Presidio Purple, which is from our By the Bay collection. And the red is called Cable Car Red, and that is also from the By the Bay collection. So I've got my first layer down, and then I'm going to start doing the fun stuff. So just let me see if I can find my ink
Before
pad.
you start with the fun stuff, let's move back to the actual tin. So if you look in this tin, you can see that this has melted, and you know it happened while Tanya was making her flower first layer, so it actually happened pretty quickly. And you can see a little bit of the silver in there. You can see the blueberry, and the white that you see was that polymer core that I was talking about. So we're going to take this and we're going to go to our silicone mold, and I'm going to pour in the first flower. I'm actually going to turn that off. So I created a little spout, and I'm just going to pour into a silicone mold. You can buy silicone molds anywhere. There's tons on the market, and they can be baking molds, they can be candy molds, wax molds, soap making molds, as long as it's silicone. So I've poured it in, and it's got a nice, a little bit of a strand there. See, what's nice is if you have that happen, you can just pour it back in.
And then you can reheat it,
and
right?
You can reheat it, and you can add more color, and you can do lots of things with that. Now, I'm going to show you something as well. I put quite a bit in there for that. I'm going to reheat this a little bit. So if there were any chunks left over, any strands, you wanted to snip off something, you can reuse this.
All right, so now while we've been looking at this, you just added some more embossing powder to the tips of your petals and then more.
Yeah, I just swiped the edges of the petals with my ink pad, and I've just gone over and put some ultra high embossing powder on it just to get that lovely chunky effect.
Okay.
So I'm just going to repeat the process again with one of the glitters. So just quickly, I'm not even bothering about where my ink pad is hitting the flowers. So just in the general.
Okay, now we're adding glitter. And what are you doing here? Oh,
I was going to show you the difference with ultra high and regular powders, but I don't want to get in her way. So
okay.
Let me show you. If you were pouring, and it's a little tip, if you were pouring and using this heat gun process with the tin, and your embossing powder was a little cool, you could just hit it with a little bit of heat from the top, and then you see it start to melt right away. And then I can continue pouring. Okay. Right.
All right. Okay.
This one is actually probably done. It doesn't take very long. This larger mold is actually going to be about 40 seconds. What you want to be sure is that you don't touch this. It's really hot. I made that mistake once. If the middle doesn't jiggle anymore, then it's done. And then you just pop it out and look at that.
There's a little rose.
There's your little rose.
It's actually a big chunky rose. So now what are you doing over here on the big flower?
So I've just gone over the edges and I've embossed over it with one of the silver glitters. It's called Bling Bling, quite appropriately. And then I have pressed my flower into my ink pad again. So I've pressed it all over, and now I'm adding the clear ultra high all over it, just to sort of give the whole thing a sort of cohesive look, and it gives it a lovely gloss, which makes it look like glass.
So the ultra high is a lot thicker, is that right? And it makes it look kind of glossy?
So if you look here, you can see that the grain of the ultra high is much chunkier than, say, the grain of all of our regular powders, which is most of the line. And the reason for that is, again, it's kind of in the technique. If you wanted to create this thickness or this thicker look, you could layer and layer and layer several times the regular powder, or you can use, one layer of the powder, or even if you're using the silver metallic like Tanya did, just use the ultra high and you get this effect right away because the grain is thicker.
And you can see that the melted is much, much, much finer than the regular. We also have a super fine embossing powder.
Which will be in between here.
Yeah, but this is much finer, so it's almost like dust.
And the point of the melted is to add to your powders when you want to extend them, so you can make a real big piece where you're not using too much of your powders.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So I've just put our ultra high all over it, and now I'm melting the entire thing down. And even though this is ultra high, you can see how quickly that just starts to melt.
And that silver's really showing up now.
Yeah. So I'm almost done. So I'm not really bothering about the center that much, but because that's going to get covered up with our flower. And I can just put a glue dot there, and there you have it.
All right. Thank you so much, ladies.
You're welcome, and I hope you try out some of our colors. The range of colors is fantastic, and we came out with 2 new kits this show called, they're both embossing glitter kits, and they're called Desert Sands and Girls Night Out, and they're limited edition, so when they're sold out, that's it. We're not manufacturing anymore.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Jennifer and Tanya.
Thank you.
This is called Wow Embossing Powders. We looked at the melted, the ultra high, the regular embossing powders, some of the glitters, and I think that's, everything we did with some molds and fun stuff. So thanks so much. I'm Noelle Hyman with paperclipping.com.